Once upon a time, there was a grisaille, a colorless, lonely, boring grisaille. Painted with only black, white, and gray, it waits, dreaming of one day somebody coming to rescue it with some color. Will you be the one to bring the colors of this grisaille's dreams to life? I'm Miss Frizzle, and this is How to Glaze. You can use any transparent pigment that you'd like to glaze a painting. For this project, I'm using ultramarine blue, some pyroline red, a bit of quinacridone rose, some bright yellow lake, some quinacridone gold or burnt umber, and our glazing medium, liquid. But you can use any oil medium you prefer. Making sure to always have the reference image on hand, I start by mixing out my first glaze. Whenever I'm painting any sort of landscape, I always prefer to work back to front. So of course, I'm starting with our sky. This painting in particular is inspired by a painting that was made during Renaissance times. Back in that time, blue paint was really hard to come by. So they would mix it in with lots of oil and gently glaze it over the surface of a painting. We want to emulate that same technique of thin layers of pigment across the whole surface, while still keeping in mind the general hue family of the area that we're glazing. For the first glaze layer especially, I like to go in with just the general hue family of whatever the object is. After covering large areas with pigment, you can go back in and wipe out any of the highlights that you wanted to leave behind. This will help make sure that you don't drown out any bright highlights by using layers and layers of paint, because there will be lots of layers. The reason why I like to use a fast drying medium like liquid when I paint is because usually you want each glazing layer to dry completely before you add another one. Obviously, with oil paint, that can get really time consuming. And while old Italian Renaissance painters had a lot of time on their hands, I don't. And liquid dries overnight. But as you can see, we have a lot more layers to go. After that first layer of generalized overall hues are dry, my next glazes are done specifically using primary colors. You can already see this yellow bringing this side of the landscape to life. The difference in vibrancy is crazy. You start observing every object in your landscape from the standpoint of this needs to be a little more yellow and this needs to be a little more blue. Almost like you're pushing each color in a certain direction, rather than trying to mix out a bunch of individual colors to match everything in your reference image. Sometimes this way of thinking while you paint can take some getting used to. That's because glazing requires visual mixing, rather than the manual mixing of pigments like what we usually do when we mix out our paints. Visual mixing is when we layer separate individual colors on top of each other or right next to each other, without actually mixing those physical pigments together. By doing so, your brain subconsciously mixes those colors together. You see this same concept used a lot in pointillism, but that is where you see these colors paired next to each other, rather than layered on top. Something to keep in mind while you're glazing is that you don't want to overlap too much color into other areas. Make sure to always re-establish your highlights in between each glaze. All of your shadows will naturally get darker the more colors you layer on top, but your highlights will continually need that boost of pigment being wiped off of them or more white pigment being added onto them. Otherwise, it'll end up looking like you turned the brightness down on your whole painting by the time you're done with your glazes. My last tip when glazing is to make sure to continually have a conversation between all the elements in your painting. Now this is pretty generalized, as this is something that you do all the time when making art. But especially when glazing, you want to incorporate colors from different glazes on different areas of your painting into the surrounding areas so that everything looks cohesive and like they belong in a similar environment. And if you stay centered, patient, and continually check your reference image as you go, you'll end up transforming that grisaille into something beautiful. This kind of glow is something that you only ever get with glazing. The way that light reflects through these colors and back at our eyes mimics the colors that we see in real life like no other painting method does. If you are someone who is experimenting with oils and wants to get that old Renaissance look, I really hope that you try this method out sometime. Comment down below if there are any other painting techniques that you want to learn about. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.